The bombs hit. The buildings burned. And then nothing changed. Not because the buildings survived, because something the bombs couldn't reach did. That's the part that doesn't get explained. You might think a war involving direct U.S. airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities would settle the question once and for all. It didn't. Here's what the coverage reported. The facilities were hit. The centrifuges were disrupted. The program was set back years. Here's what that framing quietly skips. What a setback actually means for a program that had already crossed the threshold that mattered most. Iran wasn't just building centrifuges, it was building knowledge. And that distinction between physical infrastructure and accumulated knowledge is what the entire strike assessment missed. Knowledge doesn't have GPS coordinates you can feed into a targeting system. So, what did the airstrikes actually destroy? And what did they leave completely, structurally intact? That question turns out to have a much stranger answer than the headlines allowed. Start with what we actually know, and where that account starts to get strange. The strikes targeted the three sites that form the visible spine of Iran's nuclear fuel cycle. Here's where the geography starts doing its own kind of work. Fordow, Natanz, Isfahan, each one playing a different role, each one revealing something different about what a strike could reach and what it couldn't. Fordow is the one that gets the most attention, and the reason tells you something the post-strike assessments don't. It sits inside a mountain, not metaphorically. Literally carved into mountain bedrock near the city of Qom, placed there specifically because Iran's engineers understood that above-ground facilities were one strike away from rubble. The U.S. deployed its most powerful conventional bunker-busting munitions, the GBU-57, the massive ordnance penetrator, the kind of weapon that exists for exactly one purpose. And yet, the damage was real. Craters, collapsed tunnels, destroyed centrifuge cascades that took years to install. But here's the gap that the strike assessments glossed over. Real damage and program-ending damage are two entirely different categories, and the distance between them is exactly where the actual story lives. Here's what the strikes accomplished, technically. They destroyed or severely damaged a significant portion of Iran's installed centrifuge capacity, the physical machines that actually spin uranium hexafluoride into progressively enriched material. They disrupted the infrastructure at the most advanced enrichment sites. And they set back the timeline for producing weapons-grade material by somewhere between 1 and 3 years, depending on which assessment you use. That is not nothing. 1 to 3 years of delay in a nuclear program is meaningful. That number circulated widely. It was treated as the headline verdict. But here's the part that a timeline number can't capture. Iran had already enriched uranium to 60% purity. Weapons grade is 90%. That gap sounds large. In centrifuge terms, it is not. The physics of enrichment mean that getting from 60% to 90% is substantially faster than getting from natural uranium to 60%. You've already done the hard work. And Iran had already accumulated enough 60% material that the limiting factor wasn't enrichment capacity anymore. The limiting factor was a decision. Not a technical milestone, not a missing component. A political calculation about costs, timing, and deterrence value. Everything else, all of it, had already been assembled. That was the actual state of the program when the strikes began. So, when the facilities burned, what exactly was lost? The machines, yes. The buildings, yes. Years of recovery time, yes, though how many years is genuinely contested. But the scientific knowledge of how to build those machines, how to operate them, how to cascade them, how to manage the metallurgy and the pressure dynamics and the failure modes. That was already documented, already distributed, already held inside the institutional memory of thousands of engineers. Not one of them happened to be standing inside the buildings when the bombs arrived. You can bomb a centrifuge. You cannot bomb a curriculum. This is the part that doesn't fit neatly into post-strike briefing rooms because it doesn't produce a clean headline. Iran's nuclear program didn't begin in a centrifuge hall. It began decades earlier, under the Shah, in the era when the United States was still Iran's nuclear partner. It was sustained through 2 decades of procurement networks, international technical relationships, and a domestic education system deliberately oriented toward producing the engineers a nuclear program requires. The physical program, the halls and machines and stockpiles, was always the visible layer. The layer inspectors could visit, satellites could photograph, targeting planners could map. The underlying layer, the human capital, the institutional knowledge, the supply chains, the scientific relationships, was never housed in a building, and that layer survived the strikes completely intact. So if the knowledge survived, what did Iran actually lose? Time, primarily, and some of that time matters strategically. But time to do what? And from where and under what political conditions? That's where the picture becomes genuinely complicated in ways that simple timeline numbers don't convey. There's a category that sits just below nuclear state. It's arguably more dangerous. It's called latency. A latent nuclear state isn't a state that has a bomb. It's a state that has the capacity to build one on a timeline short enough that outside actors cannot intervene once the decision to move is made. North Korea is a nuclear state. Iran, before the strikes, was a latent nuclear state. That distinction matters enormously for how you think about what the strikes actually changed. The fundamental strategic problem was never simply, does Iran have a bomb? It was, how quickly could Iran have one if its leadership decided to move, and what levers exist to prevent that decision? Before the strikes, many analysts assessed that Iran could produce weapons-grade material within weeks through final-stage enrichment, assuming it had made the political decision to do so and was willing to accept the international consequences. That's the definition of threshold, not possession. The capacity for rapid breakout. After the strikes, that technical timeline extended substantially. The physical capacity to enrich was degraded. The rebuilt timeline depends on how quickly Iran can procure replacement components, reassemble the manufacturing base, and reconstitute the cascade infrastructure. Estimates from analysts range roughly between 1 and 2 years for meaningful reconstitution, with significant variance based on sanctions pressure, procurement access, and political will. Which sounds like a meaningful victory. And in one narrow sense, it genuinely is. 1 to 2 years of additional warning time is not nothing in a strategic environment where warning time is one of the few remaining variables that outside powers can influence. But here's what that framing requires you not to ask. What happens at the end of that 1 to 2 year window? Iran's engineers are still there. Its procurement networks, the ones that weren't physically located at Natanz or Fordow, are still there. Its regional relationships are still there. Its political incentive structure, which was driving the program in the first place, is not only still there, but has been significantly reinforced by the strikes themselves. A country that absorbed direct military strikes from the world's dominant military power does not emerge from that experience concluding that nuclear deterrence is less valuable than it thought. Here's a harder question. Did the strikes change Iran's decision about whether to eventually build a nuclear weapon? Or did they only change the timeline on which building one becomes physically possible? Those are not the same question, not even close. And conflating them is how post-strike assessments consistently overclaim what military force can accomplish against a program at this stage of development. To understand why the distinction matters, you have to look at what Iran was doing for the decade before the strikes that never appeared prominently in facility inspection reports or satellite imagery analyses. It was systematically dispersing its technical architecture. Not because it specifically anticipated American airstrikes in this form, but because it had been studying what happened to other programs, and it drew lessons. What happened to Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981 is the foundational case. A single Israeli strike destroyed a concentrated facility and, in the short term, appeared to end Iraq's program. In the medium term, Iraq significantly expanded and dispersed its program, concealing it so effectively that the international community had no picture of its true scope until after the Gulf War. What happened to Syria's Al-Kibar facility in 2007 is the other case. Another concentrated facility, another single strike, another apparent success. Iran's strategic planners watched both cases. They made a different architectural choice. They built redundancy in from the start, multiple sites, multiple teams, multiple supply chains with different exposure profiles. The centrifuge manufacturing program, the industrial base that lets you replace destroyed centrifuges, was never concentrated at the sites that foreign intelligence focused most heavily on. Its dispersal was partially mapped by American and Israeli intelligence before the strikes. Partially. That second sentence is doing a lot of work. Partial mapping means partial targeting. And a strike plan built on partial information isn't eliminating a program. It's eliminating the part of a program it knows about. The parts that weren't fully mapped are the parts that matter most for what comes next. That architectural choice, made quietly years before this war, is the reason. The question, did we stop it, doesn't have a clean answer. Here's the structural reality that explains why the strikes couldn't terminate the program at its foundational level, even if they achieved their operational objectives. A nuclear weapons program at Iran's stage of development has three distinct layers with very different vulnerability profiles. The first layer is the enrichment infrastructure. The centrifuge cascades, the feed systems, the cascade halls, the enriched material stockpile. This is the layer that makes the headlines. It's physical, it's mappable, it's targetable. That layer was hit hard, damaged severely at multiple sites. The installed centrifuge capacity was dramatically reduced. The enriched material stockpile, to the extent it was housed at the struck sites, was destroyed or rendered inaccessible. So far, that reads like a clean success story. The second layer is the weaponization knowledge base. The engineering work on warhead design, on trigger mechanisms, on the physics packages, on delivery integration. This is the layer that takes enriched uranium and turns it into a weapon. It doesn't require centrifuge halls to preserve. It requires documents, models, computers, and people. That layer was partially documented and partially distributed before the strikes. Where it now resides, physically and institutionally, is unclear, and that ambiguity is itself strategically significant. The third layer is the base knowledge architecture. The trained scientific and engineering personnel, the institutional understanding, the manufacturing know-how, the procurement expertise, the deep competence that took 2 decades and enormous resources to accumulate. That layer was not meaningfully degraded by the strikes. So to put it plainly, the strikes destroyed Layer 1, partially disrupted Layer 2 in ways that are not fully assessed, and left Layer 3 intact. Which layer actually determines whether Iran can reconstitute a weapons capability? In every historical case of a nuclear program that was physically disrupted and later reconstituted, the answer is Layer 3. Always Layer 3. Iraq's program, when its full scope was revealed after 1991, had preserved its knowledge base through years of sanctions and inspections, even as its physical infrastructure was stripped away. North Korea rebuilt its capabilities after devastating external pressure, because the knowledge layer was never meaningfully touched. Pakistan's program survived colossal political pressure because the expertise was diffused through institutions that sanctions couldn't dismantle. Physical facilities are reconstructible when the knowledge to reconstruct them still exists. Knowledge, in the current state of military technology, is not destroyable through conventional airstrikes. That's not a criticism of the strike planners, it's a structural limit. The tools that dismantled Iraq's overt military capacity in 1991 were built for a different kind of problem: concentrated, physical, and mappable. A mature knowledge-based program presents a different geometry entirely, so if the program was always going to survive in some form, why did the strikes happen? What was anyone actually trying to accomplish? The honest answer requires acknowledging that the strikes served multiple purposes simultaneously, and permanently ending Iran's nuclear program was almost certainly not the most realistic of them. What the strikes accomplished in terms of their real strategic function, they bought time. Not disarmament, but delay. And delay, in specific political circumstances, creates space for other things to happen. They demonstrated conclusively that the United States was willing to absorb the political costs, the military risks, and the regional destabilization associated with direct strikes on Iranian territory. That demonstration changed something in the decision-making calculus of Iran's leadership in ways that are difficult to quantify but genuinely real. They destroyed significant installed capacity that Iran would require years and enormous resources to rebuild, resources that could otherwise be spent on other elements of national power. They created a window in which the physical program is degraded, the political costs of continued defiance are elevated, and the incentive structure around a negotiated framework is somewhat more favorable than it was before. The strikes weren't presented as a solution, but in realistic strategic terms, a solution was never what conventional military force could deliver at this stage. They were, whether anyone said this out loud or not, a forcing function. But a forcing function toward what? That's the question. The post-strike coverage, with its strike assessment graphics and reconstitution timeline estimates, was not particularly structured to answer. The answer is uncomfortable. The only durable outcome to a nuclear standoff at the stage Iran had reached, where the knowledge base already exists, where the engineers are still there, where the political incentive to maintain deterrence capability has arguably grown stronger after being struck, is either a negotiated framework that Iran's leadership genuinely chooses to enter and comply with, or eventual reconstitution of the program in some form. There is no conventional military option on known facilities that produces a third outcome. And the harder truth is that even a significantly expanded military campaign would face the same fundamental constraint: you cannot destroy knowledge with bombs. Consider what Iran's leadership now faces. Its facilities are damaged. Its military prestige has absorbed a real blow. Its regional position is complicated by the ongoing pressure. Its economy, already under severe sanction strain, faces additional reconstruction costs. It faces a genuine strategic choice. It can signal real willingness to negotiate, accepting verifiable constraints on the program in exchange for sanctions relief, a normalization path, and the removal of acute military pressure. Or it can continue, more quietly, more dispersed, more hardened against future strikes, understanding with much greater clarity exactly how its previous architecture failed and what a more resilient replacement architecture would look like. Iran's strategic planners are not irrational actors performing random choices. They watched what happened to Libya when Gaddafi voluntarily surrendered his unconventional weapons programs in 2003, accepted international inspectors, and normalized relations with the West. They watched what happened to Gaddafi roughly 8 years later. They watched what happened to Iraq. Twice. When inspectors were invited in under international pressure. They have spent 2 decades drawing conclusions from both histories, and those conclusions do not straightforwardly point toward voluntary disarmament. So what does a rational Iranian nuclear strategist do in the aftermath of strikes that destroyed the visible program but left the knowledge base intact? The answer, working from the incentive structure, is almost certainly maintain the program at the knowledge and manufacturing know-how layer while engaging publicly in whatever diplomatic process reduces the immediate military pressure and buys recovery time. Rebuild more dispersed, more hardened, more ambiguous. Keep the threshold status achievable, even if the timeline extends. In other words, essentially the strategy that made the pre-strike program impossible to fully assess or terminate through intelligence collection. Here's what the available evidence suggests about where things stand, stated as plainly as the uncertainty allows. The physical enrichment program will take longer to reconstitute than Iranian officials will publicly acknowledge and shorter than American officials will publicly claim. Both parties have incentives to misrepresent the timeline in their preferred directions. The weaponization knowledge, the technical work on warhead design and weapons integration has not been destroyed. It has been relocated, compartmentalized, and in some cases moved outside of Iranian territory entirely, to locations where its preservation is not dependent on the security of any single country. The political decision about whether to cross the final threshold, to build and deploy a nuclear weapon, is now more complex than it was before the strikes, but not because the strikes removed the option. Because they altered the cost-benefit calculus in ways that cut in multiple directions simultaneously, not all of them pointing toward restraint. That altered calculus is actually the most significant outcome of the strikes, more significant, in a durable sense, than the physical damage. It isn't primarily a military outcome. It's a psychological and strategic one. The strikes communicated something to Iran's leadership that years of sanctions, covert operations, and diplomatic pressure had failed to fully land. The United States would enter a direct military confrontation it had spent decades and enormous political capital trying to avoid. That signal has real strategic value. But signals only maintain their value if they're followed by something that converts the forced change in conditions into a different equilibrium. A signal without follow-through becomes, over time, just noise. And the history of nuclear standoffs at this stage of program development is not encouraging about the durability of purely military signals in the absence of negotiated frameworks. Here's where the original question, did the strikes actually stop Iran's nuclear program, begins to collapse into a different question entirely. What does stop even mean for a program at this stage? If stop means physically destroyed the installed enrichment capacity. Yes, largely, for now. If stop means eliminated the scientific and engineering knowledge base that the program rests on, no. No. Clearly and demonstrably, no. If stop means permanently changed the political decision about whether to eventually build a nuclear weapon, genuinely unclear, and the incentive structure points more toward no than the post-strike optimism acknowledged. If stop means created conditions for a durable negotiated settlement, possibly, but only if the diplomatic architecture to convert military pressure into political agreements actually materializes, and Iran's leadership concludes that a verifiable deal serves its interests better than patient reconstitution. The word stop was always carrying an enormous amount of weight in the coverage, more weight than any conventional military operation targeting physical facilities could actually bear. Come back to the beginning. The bombs hit, the buildings burned, and the real question, remains. Not because the strikes failed on their own operational terms, but because the question was always structurally harder than did we hit the target and damage the facility. Iran's nuclear program was never simply a collection of buildings on a map with coordinates. It was a decision-making architecture built on top of an institutional knowledge base, both of which are genuinely resistant to the tools that worked well enough against concentrated, immature programs. What the strikes destroyed was the visible, mappable, inspectable, physical layer. What they left intact was the layer that has always been, in every case, the actual program. The layer that reconstitutes the rest if the political will survives and the engineers remain. And that is the honest answer to the question the coverage kept circling without quite landing. The bombs hit. The buildings burned. The debate about what that means is only starting. And somewhere, the engineers still know exactly what they know.